And now a minimal amount of information becomes available to the large language model. Just that information which is required. We've spoken previously of how we can solve a very difficult problem when it comes to corporate enterprises and large language models. The example here is going to be a user generates a question which needs some oversight, and this is going to go to the large language model, which needs to provide explainability for the response. This response comes back and the corporate oversight kicks in again, and the response has to be approved before it goes back to the user. So let's look at a very, very simple example. We ask a question, the smart blocker approves that question and approves it to be sent to the large language model. And then when the response comes back from the large language model, the smart blocker then approves the response and says, yes, this response is okay. Now what gets generated on the decentralized data lake are the corresponding transactions, which is a question was asked, which was approved, which led to a response, which was also approved. And what this chain of transactions does is it provides the data required to provide the explainability for the large language model. When we look at the architecture for solving this problem, on one side we have the user who is generating the question. On the other side, we have the AI that's generating the response. What we're going to do is add a component to this architecture to represent corporate oversight. And now, whenever the user generates a question, that question goes into the decentralized privacy network. And the first thing we do is we store that information, the question and the metadata associated with that question, on a decentralized data lake. And this begins the first transaction of the query and response. Now, based on privacy filters, very select groups within the enterprise have access to this information. So there's information that becomes available for corporate oversight, and then there is that minimal information that's required in order to approve or reject the response. And based on privacy profiles, we can keep those as separate and ensure and guarantee as much confidentiality for the user's question as possible. Now the question has become available to the smart blocker, again with safe and ethical computing. So minimal amount of information, maximizing the data trust and confidentiality of the individual user. Now the smart blocker generates an approval or rejection of that question. This then becomes a transaction on the decentralized privacy network and becomes available for corporate oversight. Here's the question, was it approved, was it rejected? And now a minimal amount of information becomes available to the large language model. Just that information which is required in order to, number one, generate a response, but also to begin providing that traceability for explainability. The large language model now has the information it needs to generate a response. Now, as a part of the response, the large language model will include data that's relevant for explainability. And this then becomes the next chain in the transaction of the query and response. All of the data generated by the large language model becomes available to the explainability engine, but just a minimal amount of data becomes available to the smart blocker for corporate oversight. Now that the response has become available to the smart blocker, it's able to approve and reject that response. And this then becomes the last transaction in this query response between the user and the large language model. So this approval and rejection become fully available for corporate oversight, and we can choose to share some of that data back with the user. So the user is going to get, for example, the response, and on the condition that that response has been rejected, we're going to provide information to the user about why that question was rejected, why the response was rejected, and better ways to utilize the large language model as a tool. But in addition to that, we can also provide some minimal information back to the large language model and also to the explainability engine. And what this does is now we've completed the circle that allows that explainability engine to provide that granular traceability to be able to explain the question and the response. So this looks very complicated, but in the next video, we're going to show this actually working. From the end user's perspective, there's really no difference. They ask a question, they get a response. But now in the back end, you get all of this rich access to oversight, regulatory compliance, and we'll walk through how to implement and what the perspectives are from the different parties as they see the data going through the decentralized privacy network.